right. Let's have a word of prayer and then we're good. Our holy and divine Father in heaven, today, thank you for the time you've given us. Consider things pertaining to your church and its work and how we better organized and better guide our hearts and our thoughts. Help with all things we would seek. All right. So, so we're going to finish up a couple of things talking about last week. Talk you out this question of institution, the idea of the questions of what the church is authorized to do and what the individual is authorized to do. We're talking about two basic ideas about institutionalism. What is our authority, or why would we be able to use an outside institution to work in the church? We talked last week about the question of expedience, the idea of, well, this is something that just helps us to do what we're supposed to be doing. And so as long as it's helping us in that regard, then we have the right to do that, even though there's not a pattern or specific command or that. And what we had talked about was that our tendency when we start talking about expedience is start broadening the scope of what we're called to do. Expedient starts to become expedient not so much for what we have been called to do in the church as it is wanting to do something that's kind of peripheral to what the church is doing. We talked about some of the ideas of why so often churches have gotten into the questions of financing educational institutions, because we see the mandate in the scripture to pass on and train people to teach others. We need to be able to teach people. We need to be able to educate them in the Bible. But if we're not able to do that adequately, then maybe we need a school to do that. And if we're going to have a school, then we ought to be educating in all aspects of life, not just in spiritual things. And so all of a sudden, the work of the church, which is to build its members up in an understanding of the Word of God, has now become to give them a broad-based education. And as a result of that, well, we certainly can't do that here. So we need an external we need an external institution to do that. And so now that becomes an expedient to doing what we would argue we're supposed to be doing. But what we've really done more than anything else is simply broaden the scope of what God has called us to do. The idea of not necessarily being content with our work, but trying to broaden that a little bit. So we see a lot of that. And as a result of that, what happens, as we talked about, is that we start to emphasize the expedient over the work. In other words, the priority now is not so much about the work that we've been called to do. It's making sure that this institution survives, whether it be an orphan home, whether it be a medical center, whether it be whatever it might be. All of a sudden, it becomes an end in of itself, and we start making decisions that are intended to help it survive. Which is, well, we have an organization that teaches Christian values, but we need to be able to maintain it and keep the doors open, which means we need to compete with other institutions, which means that we need to offer secular education, which means that we need to offer, we need to bring in educators that are considered authoritative in the world. And all of a sudden we find ourselves drifting farther and farther away from what the intent really was. So that was kind of the danger. We spent most of the time talking about that. Today, we're going to talk about this other question. And if you've got your book, I'm going to do a lot of looking in the book today, just looking at some of my notes and things I've marked on. We're talking about the issue today of collective or individual responsibility. And I think there's a couple of passages that Buddy quotes in his section. On page 110 is one of them, where some of the arguments are made with the idea that if I as an individual have the right to do something, then collectively we as a church have the right to do something. And in some cases, they'll argue that you also not only have the right to do it, but the obligation to do it. So if the Christian as an individual has the obligation to, as Galatians 6 says, do good to all, well, that means that the church also had the obligation to do it. So if there's a good work that I as an individual am obligated to be doing, then that means that the church collective ought to be doing that same thing. And so he quotes a man named Batsell Barrett Baxter, that's my name, uh, who made this observation. I think this is from back in the when this original argument was being made. Says any good work which the individual as a Christian is obligated to support financially, the church is equally obligated to support financially. There has been a great deal of talk about what the individual can do in supporting good works and what the church cannot do in supporting the same good works. No such distinction is taught in the scriptures. If it is a good work which the Lord wants done, the obligation falls equally upon the individuals and upon the church, for individuals are the church. So that's the basic argument. And if you go to 114, there's a similar argument that's a little bit different, but he makes a caveat to it that I think is worth looking at. Verse over in page 114. This is from V.E. Howard in talking about institutionalism. He says there are those who try to distinguish between the work of the church and the work of Christians, indicating one to be divine and the other human. This is a fallacious reasoning. The church is composed of Christians. What the church does, Christians do. What Christians do, the church does, generally speaking. We cannot separate the Christian's work from the work of the church. So I think both those two pretty much sum it up. But now, as you look at that, there's a couple of things that, at least to me, kind of jumped out in this line of reasoning. And the first one, when he talks about the idea of the first one back on page 110, he makes this idea that a good work which an individual is obligated to support financially. I want to think about that for a second. What good work am I obligated to participate in as a Christian? First of all, what can we say that I am obligated to do as a okay? Well, sure, take care of each other. Yeah, certainly that. Um, Spread the gospel. Uh, if you're struggling with this, I suspect that it's because you're looking at that phrase and saying, "Well, good work." I mean, I could throw all kinds of things into that, right? Couldn't I? I mean, there's a whole lot of things that would be considered good if you just say, "Love God, love your neighbor." Okay, that's what I'm obligated to do. Well, how do I do that? Well, there's any number of ways that I could do that. So the question then becomes, well, all right, am I obligated to do every single one of those? I suspect we would say the answer is no. What we do is we find what we can do and we do that. Is that a pretty accurate way to say that? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Those are decisions you tend to kind of make. Now, sometimes you'll do it intentionally, but a lot of times it really is about just we just do what we can when we can. And we're not. It's not a situation where we say, you know what, it would be a really good work to build a hospital over here, but I didn't do that, so I sinned. That's not how we look at this, right? We do what is in our ability. That's what an individual does. He talks about it in terms of being obligated to do this. And so when you use that phrase obligation, now all of a sudden I'm going and saying, all right, well, if the individual is obligated to do something, then the church is also obligated to do something. And once I do that and I use really broad terms, all of a sudden I can start looping in a whole lot of things that the church is now obligated to do because the individual is obligated to do good to all. So now all of a sudden, well, if the church has to be doing good to all, well, what does that look like? Well, there's what we like to put in there. You see kind of what we start seeing when we go down this road is that becomes so open to interpretation that I can pretty much include whatever I want. Would we argue, and I think one of the authors made this point, would anybody argue that building a hospital is a good work? Of course it's a good work. That's beneficial. It's something that is good for. The real question then becomes, how do we define what is a good work? And I'm going to skip ahead of my notes a little bit, but since it's in my head, there was one of the questions that this brother, what's it, brother, he asked, and it's on page 123. You know, I think I mentioned this before. One of my issues with his writings is that he throws up a whole bunch of questions, but does not really answer. And feels to me as if, you know, the more questions I throw out about, well, how about this and how about this and, you know, what about this hypothetical, and I start throwing these out, and the implication almost seems to be, well, so many questions. There's so many unanswered things that we just can't really know anything, and so it becomes very uncertain. And he asked this question that I think actually is a pretty good question: does there need to be biblical authority to carry out good works? In other words, do we as individual Christians, or fact, we collectively as the church, do I have to have authority to do something that's good? I thought that was an interesting question. What do you think about that? Yes, no? Too vague a question? I guess where I landed on this is a little bit of a vague question, because if we think about, well, we're called to do good. That's a general authority to do good, right? But how do we define what's good? Who gets to define what's good? I'm getting kind of 50,000 foot, but I think this is an important question, because once I say, well, we need to do good, and the church has a responsibility to do good, I have to determine what's good. Well, how do I do that? Who gets to determine what's good and what's? It's not so much I have to have the authority. It's not so much that I need to go find authority in Scripture to do good, but I do have to find an authority in Scripture to define what it is that's good that I need to be doing. I mean, is that a fair statement? That's where we start to come into problems. And so then the question becomes, well, is it different? Is the good that I do as an individual going to be different than the good I do collectively? Now, the argument that's being made is that no, there's no difference. That the church and the individual are the same thing. They do everything exactly the same way. And as I'm thinking about that, and Buddy makes some arguments about this over on page 115, and you get through some of them. But as you think about between an individual collective, is it true to say that the church can do everything that the individual can do? Is there no distinction whatsoever between that? Can you think of one thing that the individual Christian can do that the church does not do? Think about it. You'll hear a couple of them, you go, oh yeah, of course. Okay, discipline your children. I think that's a great example. Who's right? Is it the church's right to determine how I raise my child? And this is how you need to discipline. This is when his curfew should be. This is what rules you should have. This is what chore. There's a lot of things that, as a parent, that's your job. It's not the church's job. There's a distinction there between that role. Now, staying in the family. Does the Bible give any distinctions between the individual and the collective role in terms of family? Well, widows and orphans. How about, well, widows specifically? How about widows? Okay. In fact, let's go over there. 1 Timothy 5 and look at this real quick. And this goes back to something that one of the guys said. He said the Bible never makes any distinction between the individual and the collective in terms of their responsibilities. But 1 Timothy 5 very clearly does. In verse 9, he's talking about how to deal with those. In fact, actually, let's back up. Back to verse 3. It says, honor widows who are truly widows. Widows indeed, which is probably a better thing. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and then make return, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hopes on God, continued in supplications and prayers night and day, who is self-indulgent, is dead even while she lives. Command these things also that they may be reproached. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And then he goes on and give these qualifications about enrollment. And when we talk about a widow being enrolled, what we're talking about here is a situation where here's a widow who meets these certain qualifications, and the church is now supporting her financially. And he says there's a lot of things that she has to do. 60 years of age, having the wife of one husband, reputation for good works. He goes on and describes these. In verse 11, he says, but refuse to enroll younger widows for when their passions draw near, draw them away from the Christ they desire to marry, will incur condemnation for having abandoned. So he describes the fact that there's certain women that should not be included. So in verse 16, he says, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. but the church not be burdened so that it may those who are truly widows indeed, or those who fit this particular. Now, what's the difference individually between my individual responsibility to a widow and church collective responsibility to a widow? Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, it's an important point to make. It's an important distinction. Now, having said that, there is, I do want to make this clarification since we're kind of talking about this. There is a difference between a widow who has a need and a widow who has an ongoing need. And that's what Paul's talking about here. He's talking about someone who she has no one to take care of her. This is not someone who, like, she has a one-time thing like any other member of the church might have, that we could have a discussion about, is this a need for this person? I'm not saying we should or shouldn't, saying it's a different situation. He's not saying you can never ever help this person, but what he is saying is this person is not someone who ought to be on the ongoing roles where we will continue. And so there's a distinction there. This is not the church's responsibility. Whose responsibility is it? Families, right? Yeah. You have someone who can care for you. The first responsibility here is that the family take care of them. And so there's a distinction there. And I was thinking about this a little bit. It would be really easy, and I think we do this in a lot of ways, for us to say, well, we just let the church take care of all these things, and we don't have to worry about it. The church has more resources; it could do a better job than I can. The parallel I kept thinking about is like if you have kids and you give them chores, and you come home. Well, did you do the chores? Well, no, I paid my sister to do them. What's your reaction going to be to that? I mean, hey, it got done, right? No big deal. Is that? But that's not really the point, though, is it? A lot of times, yeah, you want them to do it. That was the whole point of getting them to do it. And I think sometimes what we miss in this whole conversation of collective and individual responsibility is that when we're called to do good to all, especially to those of the household of faith, as Galatians, the purpose of that is not so that we can all get together in the church and figure out, all right, let's put our money together, and then the elders can decide how we're going to do that. The point was, God is saying, I want you to go do, because that's going to help you grow. That's going to make you a better Christian. That's going to force you to care and to love your neighbor and to love God, as you've been called to do. If I just give that to the church, I've missed God's point of giving me that responsibility, and I've also missed that opportunity for growth. And so there's a distinction that's made, and I think for us to simply say, well, whether the church does it collectively or the individual, it really doesn't matter. It matters because God assigned this to the individual. And I think when you start looking at that and the opportunities for us to do good, start seeing all the opportunities that an individual is going to have that the church will never see. And the lack of growth that's going to happen if my response to that is, well, that's what the church ought to be doing. And so there's a distinction that's made. And I want to go, in fact, let's go over to Galatians 6, because I want to look at that while I'm thinking. Galatians chapter 6. This is a passage that multiple people I've read in this argument will go to. We talk about, well, what should the church be doing? Well, the church should be doing good. I think it's in Brother Duke's article. He says the same thing, that the church has a responsibility, as a command to do good. All right. Listen, look at chapter 6 and see what it's being said. Notice in verse 1. Brother, if anyone is caught in a trespass, you who are spiritual should restore him in spirit of gentleness. Who's being commanded here? Who's the command given? All of us, but a very specific person, isn't it? You who are spiritual. In other words, in a spirit of gentleness. Now, and let's think about in the context, what's being talked about. I see a brother that's struggling. What's my response to that? Is that a church worker or is it an individual worker? It is. I'm going to go help him. Now, I may come to the church with that later on if it comes to that. But this is something that you as an individual need to be. Verse 2, bear one another's burdens. So fulfill the law. Is there a sense in which we collectively do that? Yes. But there's also a sense in which we do it. In fact, he goes on, verse 4, let each one test his own work and then his reasoning to boast with himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each will have to bear his own load. Again, There's an individual responsibility that's being talked about here. He keeps going on in verse 6. Let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the teacher. In other words, is there a collective sense in which we do that? But he's speaking to an individual here. You need to honor the one who has helped you spiritually in that way. There's a lot of, and he ends up talking verse 8, for the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. Again, he's talking about an individual again. So with that in mind, because I think one of the authors actually said this, that, clearly the context is talking about a collective work, but it is. And so when we get down to verse 9, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season reap if we do not give up. I'm talking about what you as an individual are doing. Now, we're going to do some of that collectively. There's that too. But the primary thing is you need to be out there doing what you need to do, reaping what you have sown. And so he says, as then we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, especially to those who are of the household of faith. To me, this context, there's nothing in here specifically that's going to argue that this is a collective command that says we ought to be doing good to everyone in terms of doing benevolent actions. Now, if you notice, as we're reading this, what's the good that we've been talking about? Just as you look through some of the things that we mentioned, what kind of good things are we talking about in Galatians? So their burdens. What else? What's the first thing he talks about? First one. What's the first? Okay, yeah. Restore someone who is struggling. There's a spiritual component there. When we get down to verse 6, what are we talking about? We're talking about sharing a spiritual fellowship relationship there. Someone who is sharing in the Word of God. We're talking about spiritual actions here. And so when it gets down to do good, I think sometimes we make this, when we see do good, we automatically think of feeding somebody or giving somebody money or benevolence of some sort. I'm not totally sure that that's what he's talking about here. Now, which is not to say we shouldn't do that. But the primary emphasis here seems to be, to me, that we ought to be doing good spiritually for all, especially to the household of faith. We ought to be seeking our spiritual welfare, our spiritual good. For one who is not a member of the Lord's church, what does that look like? Teaching the gospel, right? Reaching out to that person, encouraging that person, trying to bring them to Christ. So there's a lot going on here that I'm not sure is necessarily limited to or even is really necessarily talking about benevolent actions. But if it is, let's just say that Galatians 6:10 is talking about good to everyone. In other words, you need to, if no matter who it is out there, if they have a physical need, you need to be meeting it. Should we see that example in the New Testament? Somewhat. I think, right, that at least one time, because we see the church collectively working together to do good. Don't we? We see examples of that. 1 Corinthians talks about that. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 talks about that. We see the example, and I think it's Acts 10, where Paul and Barnabas bring relief for the saints in Judea and bring it to the church in Jerusalem. Plenty of examples of the desire to do good. And yet we don't have any examples of the church collectively doing good for the broader community. It never happened. Always focused on the saints. And it's one of those things where we have to at some point let examples kind of inform how we interpret something, especially if it's, I think I've mentioned this, but when we see good to all, when we look at the word, we see the word all used. How often would you say the word all is used in our normal everyday lives? I mean, everybody in the entire universe, no exceptions. That we never use all like that, do we? There's always, at least in context, maybe it's everybody in the community. Maybe it's everybody, a lot of times it's like, I always give the example of, when I tell somebody who's going back to some place where I used to live, say hi to everybody. We all know what that means, right? I'm not even talking about saying hi to everybody in the city. I'm talking about, you and I know some common people. Say hi to those people. There's a specific group that's being dealt with, and the context is going to determine that. And so I think that depending on where you're looking I know Second Corinthians 9 talks about. In fact, let's look over there real quick, because this passage gets used a lot as well. Because unlike Galatians 6, 2 Corinthians 9 is specifically talking about this idea of benevolent actions. They're collecting for the saints, and he says that he's talking about the saints that are being ministered to. 12 of 2 Corinthians 9. He says, "For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs, it is also overflowing in many things. God, by their approval of this service, glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ, generosity of your contribution to him and for all others." People will go to that and say, "Well, see, there you go. It was there. You're giving to them specifically, but you're also giving to all. In other words, you're doing this for everybody, even people that are not members." Uh, that's why we always have to remember. Well, all doesn't always mean a universal all. In this case, I would argue that it's talking about all the saints everywhere. Not just the saints in Judea that you're concerned about. You're helping Christians in Asia. You're helping Christians in Corinth, wherever it might be. You have a desire to help God's people, and we won't get into a lot of that because it's kind of by the point of what we're doing. I know we're going to talk about this more detailed in later lessons. Just a point that if you did this reading, you'll probably notice that they just kind of gloss over this idea. Well, we know that we're supposed to do benevolence to everybody around us because Galatians 6 says that we're to do. So it's important to remember that there's going to be a context. So, but as we're thinking about that, I want to go back to this question because I know other examples of individual and collective distinctions. We mentioned something earlier. How do we deal with sin? When Jesus in Matthew 18, for example, remember in Matthew 18, he talks about if you have a brother that sins against you, what do we do? It's the first thing go to him. We try to work that out, right? If that doesn't work, then we take two or three witnesses. That doesn't work, then we go to the church. At what point does the individual responsibility now become the collective responsibility? When the collective is called to deal with it, but not before. So there's how we deal with sin is going to be a distinction sometime. The other one that I hadn't really thought about. How is an individual told to make a living in the Bible? What is our instructions? How are we supposed to earn a living? Working, right? Earning a living, working with our hands, being busy. That's Ephesians 4:28 talks about that. The idea that you are to not steal, but to work with your hands, to share with those who have. How's the church supposed to raise funds? Church had the authorization to open a business. If the individual could do it, the church could do it. Because go ahead, Jim. Yeah, we have an example that has been approved that shows that how we're to do that. We see it over and over again in Acts. In Acts 4 and 5, when the needy widows, or the 6, excuse me, when the widows who were needy in Jerusalem were called up. How do we deal with that? Well, we're going to put men in our group over that, and they will see about collecting from the saints for the purposes of dealing with the need. In 1 Corinthians 16, of course, on the first day of the week, let it you lay by in store as you prospered, so there'd be no collections going to come. That's the way that was intended to work. And so we see this example of, the collective does not earn money the way the individual does. So, and you start thinking about some of the other things. For example, talk about caring for a family. The church doesn't get married. I'm married to a wife. She's married to a husband. That has nothing to do with the church. It's an individual activity that happens between us. The church doesn't do that. The church has no responsibilities in maintaining that marital relationship. That's her and me and God. So there's a lot of examples of how we can't necessarily just say that, well, as long as the Christian has the authority to do it, as long as it's the work of the individual, then that means it's also the work of the church. And if you'll notice, you go to 114 where he makes this caveat that I kind of like. He makes this point. He says the church is composed of Christians. What the church does, Christians do. What Christians do, the church does, generally speaking. When somebody says generally speaking, what are they saying? Exceptions. All right. Well, how do we figure that exception? That's where we become a problem, right? Because I've heard people here. I've made the argument. I've heard people make the argument. Well, if the church can do everything the Christian can do, you know, the church has no responsibilities to my wife. I have my body, my body is my wife's. It's not the church's. And the answer is, well, that's ridiculous. Well, of course it is. But who says it's ridiculous? How do we get that distinction? Well, go to the Bible, right? And we look and see, all right, these are the roles that are defined for the individual. And we know that if the husband and the wife have this relationship, by definition, nobody else does. It doesn't have to say that that nobody else has this responsibility to her. That it's completely given to us by necessary inference. So by the same token, if I look at what the church is called to do, the only way I'm going to be able to make a distinction of that is to look at what the Bible says and make the argument. Look, if the Bible gives me a clear pattern on what the church is authorized to do, then the easiest way for me to consistently and logically make that distinction is to say that I'm going to use the biblical model for what the church is allowed to do, and that will be the church's authorization. Everything else is going to then fall to the individual. Sometimes it's hard for me to, I don't always. I just want to say one thing, because, but for those of y'all, I know y'all weren't Sunday morning. I was offered a position to a private, so you're going to be going, trying to figure that out. It's likely it will probably be. I want to make sure y'all knew because I know you haven't been involved in those discussions, and sorry that's taking. I just want to make sure. Anyway, with that in mind, well, let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll it's Fry Road in Houston.